Let's jump right into a deeply fascinating and honestly pretty dark philosophical journey today. In this explainer, we're diving straight into a mythic fable that absolutely dismantles the idea of modern inauthenticity. We're looking at what happens when the linguistic masks and massive facades we built to protect ourselves crash headfirst into undeniable absolute truth. If you're into philosophical thought experiments that really challenge how we construct reality, you're going to love this descent into honest corruption. Picture a vibrant, loud marketplace bazaar. Suddenly, all that noise and chaos just drops away into this cold, nihilistic stillness. Enter the Obsidian Knight. His heavy footsteps echo with what the text calls the terrifying silence of the void. This isn't just a quiet moment, right? It's a heavy, crushing presence that completely warps the atmosphere around him. He brings this absolute stillness to a place that literally thrives on noise and distraction, a noise that our other main character, the Stargazer, desperately relies on to hide his own paralyzing fear of meaninglessness.
Section 1. The Nihilistic Bazaar.
So let's unpack this core conflict. We've got the Stargazer standing up there in a towering outward structure. He's basically using a sneer of cynical knowledge to mask his paralyzing fear and internal suffering. He actually thinks he's mocking the vacuum that threatens to consume him. But then, facing him, is the Obsidian Knight. The Knight doesn't need a structure. He embodies the raw void itself, characterized entirely by a cold stillness and silent rot. So it's a clash between the Stargazer hiding behind his gilded scaffold and the Knight bringing the raw, terrifying truth. Part 2. Parables of the Void. The debate here isn't fought with swords. It's fought with absolute truths. The Knight starts systematically tearing down the Stargazer's psychological defenses using these grim, devastating parables. He kicks things off with the parable of the empty flare. He tells the Stargazer, "You ignite your brilliant flares to convince yourself the room is full of treasures, yet you are the only thing rotting inside it." It's a brutal critique of what he calls a false overgoing. Basically, it's just virtue signaling to try and entertain the abyss. The Stargazer thinks his cynical knowledge gives him mastery over decay, but the Knight points out the sheer absurdity of it. You can't impress a black hole with flashy virtue signaling. All that bright display does is blind him to his own inner rot. The Stargazer tries to defend himself, claiming that his fear of meaninglessness is really just a costume he wears, but the Knight hits back with the parable of the mirror of lead. He argues that this so-called mastery is just a borrowed costume of wisdom. Because the Stargazer refuses to embrace the raw truth of his condition, he's traded his golden illusions for this heavy, dull surface. And this mirror doesn't reflect a hero, it reflects a shadowless man, completely haunted by linguistic ghosts. He's spent so much time performing, he's literally forgotten how to be genuinely solid. Next up is the parable of the anchor of rot. Picture a foolish sailor. The Stargazer has built this massive outward structure to stay anchored to a shore that literally doesn't exist anymore. The tragedy here is just profound. He entirely fails to realize that the only thing that can actually keep him afloat in the void isn't his fancy gilded scaffold. It's the silent rot of the wood itself. He absolutely refuses to accept his own decay, even though that decay is the only real, authentic thing about him. Feeling desperate, the Stargazer argues that words are his currency. He claims he's collected enough morality, virtue, and brilliance to buy his way out of any sinkhole. But the Knight systematically reveals these linguistic illusions to be nothing but dust. What the Stargazer insists is virtue and brilliance, the Knight exposes as inner rot, psychic decay, and ghostly fluctuation. That currency the Stargazer's relying on, it is completely bankrupt in the face of the void. Which brings us right into the parable of the weighted word. The Knight flat out tells him that his purse is filled with dust. The Stargazer's perceived meanings are exposed as psychic decay under the too honest light of absolute truth. Every single word the Stargazer speaks doesn't project strength at all. Instead, it just echoes the groaning of the earth right below his crumbling scaffold. You can really feel the tension peaking here. The Stargazer's linguistic armor is turning to lead, and it's dragging him straight down in this descent into honest corruption. Section 3. The Great Noon. We're arriving at the absolute climax of the fable. The Great Noon is the event where the light of absolute truth is positioned directly overhead. There's literally no room for shadows, and masks can no longer hide any internal suffering. Yet, even as this light arrives, the Stargazer makes one final desperate boast. He says, "I will stand my ground as the sun reaches its zenith. My brilliance will finally cast a shadow that matches my performance." It's an unbelievable display of false confidence. He honestly still believes his constructed persona, his brilliance, has enough substance to cast a shadow against the light of absolute truth. But of course, this builds to an inevitable, tragic unraveling. First, in the parable of the Shadow's Edge, the great noon arrives, and because the stargazer lacks genuine substance, the light exposes him entirely. Then, his form starts to fluctuate and lose shape. The light passes right through him, leaving him as nothing more than a ghost of his own making. Finally, we hit the parable of the final scaffold. It turns out the knight's arrival wasn't a battle at all. It was a ritual of total unraveling. The stargazer's so-called masterpiece of modern humanity just completely collapses into the ruins of his own inauthenticity.
Part 4. The Inquisitor's Verdict.
So the stargazer has fallen. But to truly grasp the scale of what just happened, we have to pull back. Remember, we've been observing this whole thing through the detached eyes of the High Inquisitor from his high tower of knowledge. He closes his manuscript with this chilling, cold detachment and observes, modern humanity has lived so inauthentically that it mistakes the first tremor of the earth for the final judgment. Wow. The stargazer actually thought the collapse of his scaffold was the end of the world, but the Inquisitor knows the terrifying truth. This total unraveling isn't the finale. It's just the opening movement of a much vaster decay. The Inquisitor lays out the reality of this vaster decay. The shadow of the night? It merely dismantled the first of many masks. The stargazer's journey into the hungry void has just begun. And here's the really cruel part. The Inquisitor acknowledges that even his own categorized rigid structures up in the high tower will eventually have to face the same existential emptiness. Pretty soon, there will be no flares left to light for anyone. Not for the stargazer, and definitely not for the Inquisitor. And that brings us to the ultimate thesis of this dark fable. The text argues that eventually all external scaffolds, all that virtue signaling, and all our cynical knowledge will be entirely stripped away by the light of the great noon. Every single one of us has to learn what it means to stand upon our own corruption, because that is the only honest ground remaining. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. When the void approaches and your brilliant flares go out, can you stand upon your own honest corruption? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time as we keep unpacking the wild ideas that shape our reality.